This is session one of Kitchen Table Conversations, Why Recognition Matters. And we have gathered tonight acknowledging First Peoples of our country. The Together Yes provides this group agreement, which is just for us to think about how we will operate
The Uluru Statement from the Heart. We, gathered here at the 2017 National Constitutional Convention, coming from all points of the southern sky, make this statement from the heart. Our Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander tribes were the first sovereign nation of the Australian continent and its adjacent islands, and possessed it under our own laws and customs. This our ancestors did, according to the reckoning of our culture from the creation, according to the common law from time immemorial, and according to science more than 60,000 years ago. This sovereignty is a spiritual notion. The ancestral tie between the land, or Mother Nature, and the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples who were born therefrom remain attached thereto and must one day return thither to be united with our ancestors. This link is the basis of the ownership of the soil, or better, of sovereignty. It has never been ceded or extinguished and coexists with the sovereignty of the Crown. How could it be otherwise? That peoples possessed a land for 60 millennia and this sacred link disappears from world history in merely the last 200 years? With substantive constitutional change and structural reform, we believe this ancient sovereignty can shine through as a fuller expression of Australia's nationhood. Proportionally, we are the most incarcerated people on the planet. We are not an innately criminal people. Our children are aliened from their families at unprecedented rates. This cannot be because we have no love for them. And our youth languish in detention in obscene numbers. They should be our hope for the future. These dimensions of our crisis tell plainly the structural nature of our problem. This is the torment of our powerlessness. We seek constitutional reforms to empower our people and take a rightful place in our own country. When we have power over our destiny, our children will flourish. They will walk in two worlds, and their culture will be a gift to their country. We call for the establishment of a First Nations voice enshrined in the Constitution. Makarrata is the culmination of our agenda, the coming together after a struggle. It captures our aspirations for a fair and truthful relationship with the people of Australia and a better future for our children based on justice and self-determination. We seek a Makarrata Commission to supervise a process of agreement making between governments and First Nations and truth-telling about our history. In 1967, we were counted. In 2017, we seek to be heard. We leave base camp and start our trek across this vast country, and we invite you to walk with us in a movement of the Australian people for a better future.
So the first opportunity for us to share together is to respond to the statement that we've heard read and respond to these questions. What does the statement evoke in you, and which parts in particular resonate with you?
We're back
Well,
again.
how did you go with your conversation and John's questions?
Well, we talked around a lot of things. I'm not sure we came to any conclusions.
Okay. Anyone want to volunteer something briefly?
I think this voice, as long as it's got the stuff around it, that if the communities are asking for stuff, so we were talking about, banning alcohol, that's enforced for the whites as well as the Indigenous people, so that there's some teeth to what these people are wanting. Whereas, if you just leave it so there's no teeth to it, people are they'll get around it.
Yeah. So that's one of the criticisms of the No campaign who are Aboriginal, that they're worried it actually doesn't have enough power to it. So it's really going to depend on what the Parliament does in terms of listening to it and whether they want to enact the advice that those people would give it.
Yes, that's good. Yeah.
And there's presumably different communities are going to want different things. It won't necessarily be one size fits all.
I think that's right, Bill. It won't be one size fits all. There's many, many Aboriginal nations, and they're all located in very different geographical and cultural terrain.
That's right.
Yeah.
And an urban community, say in Dubbo or Western Sydney, is going to have different issues to Yuendamu or Yandala or wherever.
Yeah.
That's right. I mean, hopefully it would be flexible enough to be able to cover that, where they could present this as an issue for the people in the middle of Australia as opposed to an issue for the Aboriginal people in Mount Druitt.
We're going to give a bit of consideration to the nature of Aboriginal society, and then we're going to look at a little bit of a timeline. And what you have on the screen there is an initial timeline which ends with the first fleet arriving in Botany Bay in 1788. And when we go back before that, we see significant moments in various other cultures, the terracotta warriors in China, 200 years before Christ, Plato's Republic, another 160 years before that, and then even before that, Rome formed as a republic. We go back to 2,500 years before the Common Era to when the first pyramid was built in Egypt, and a little bit before that to when they believed that Stonehenge was constructed. And that time frame is put alongside of what the best of archaeology is now telling us, that it's 50 to 60,000 years since Aborigines settled in Australia after migrating across from Africa. So that's a long, long period of time, which is why it is now called the oldest continuing civilization on Earth. So we're going to have a bit of a look at...
Before the dreaming, the Australian continent was a flat, featureless place, devoid of life. Then giant beings came down from the sky, came from across the sea and emerged from within the earth. With their arrival, the dreaming began and life was born. In the north of Australia, the Junkawal sisters gave birth to humanity. In Central Australia, Itakawara broke the marriage laws and as punishment was turned into stone, forever entombed in the landscape. On the east coast, Bayami shaped the landscape, and when his work was complete, he stepped onto a mountain and back into the sky. As they moved across the land, their giant bodies shaped the earth, creating rivers and mountain ranges. In everything they touched, they left their essence, making the landscape sacred to those who honour the dreaming, the first Australians.
If you think about the ancient civilisations that Europeans look to, such as the dynasties of the pharaohs in Egypt, then even they are young compared to the period when humans were coming to Australia.
The first Australians number more than 250 tribes, each with their own language, laws and territorial boundaries. A civilization encompassing the entire continent.
We've had this debate about Australia was a terra nullius and it was a wasted landscape and people hadn't used it and hadn't farmed it. They've discovered that, in fact, it's probably supported about 1.6 billion lives. And that's how productive Aboriginal people were able to make this part of the earth which has the most irregular and unreliable rainfall and the driest continent on earth.
80,000 years, 100,000 years, doesn't matter whether it's 60,000 years, it's an incredible length of time. It's the longest living civilization on earth, and if you can't learn something from a people that successful, then you're really defying your own intelligence.
So if you receive the resource material, you'll find this quotation is included, but it's worth reading from Dean Ashenden book called Telling Tennant's Story, The Strange Career of the Great Australian Silence, in which he reflects on the fact that Aboriginal people were active custodians of the land with lots of complexities with their language and laws and culture. And he writes this: these people found ways to live within their ecological means. They developed powerful combinations of expertise and technique to sustain and use the land, transmitted through stories, dance, instruction, injunction, and cosmology. Aboriginal peoples included every significant topographical feature of the entire continent in their imaginative world and made their material world into the biggest estate on earth. It gave them diets of grains, fruit, nut, honey, insects, meats, and for many the bounty of lakes, streams and oceans, vastly superior to that of the Europeans of the First Fleet. They enjoyed a working day that we could access and use. They enjoyed a working day that we could envy, with ample time for a rich cultural life that included painting, carving and drawing, song, dance and storytelling. They'd worked out complex forms of social organisation and an equally complex political order. Relationships between tribal groups included multi-layered rights to land and water access and use. They developed trade routes which took ochre, axe heads and other goods over many hundreds of miles. Stories and ceremonies often remembered with remarkable fidelity over centuries, travelled from one end of the continent to another along the songlines. They were multilingual. So the next question for us to consider is, how familiar do you think Australians are generally with this time frame and with the nature of Aboriginal civilisation that's been described there? And what relevance do you think that this information and understanding has on the referendum that we will be facing later this year? So they're the second lot of questions for you to consider in your group together.
Well, how did you go with all those questions? Well, here comes Nate.
I think we had an interesting discussion on a range of things.
Do you want to share any of it, Bill?
Oh, well, other people can. I mean, I was observing how, like, the film indicates, like, the Aboriginal people had a creation story like virtually every other culture on the planet to explain, you know, how the landscape was formed, you know, not having the science of continental drift, erosion, all that sort of thing, volcanism. But I was just about to say, as we went back to the group, I find it interesting. In 1788, Aboriginal society was still effectively a Stone Age culture that, quite, if you compare it even with the Asian cultures to the north, which, you know, you read they traded with, didn't seem to have taken on any of the other. Like, cultures evolved by taking the best from other cultures, and yet Aboriginal society seems to have been pretty much the same for thousands of years. And I just wondered why.
And I think that's very similar to a lot of other Indigenous cultures, like the Sami people up along the Scandinavian, Norway, Finland and Sweden.
Oh, yeah.
They're very similar to our Indigenous people and have virtually lived the same for millions of years or thousands of years.
Also, with certain Amazon tribes, it's been quite similar. I guess the short answer to that, though, it's a complex thing, is one, they were quite isolated. This is an island continent. And where we had people touching in and out and some contact in areas, it wasn't widespread and it wasn't as frequent and numerically sufficient to probably alter a culture that had actually adapted really well to this continent. And that would be the second reason. They had adapted well and they had various systems in place that allowed them to live quite a reasonable lifestyle with no need to develop anything else. So I would say isolation and the fact that they were pretty self-sufficient and nobody came to tell them that they were doing it wrong. So why change what's working well?
Makes sense.
We're going to look at a bit of a timeline of Aboriginal involvement in society, particularly since 1788, and particularly in the 20th century. So there'll be a series of sort of slides and videos that we'll look at next.
It is a summer's night on the 25th of January, 1788. 11 giant ships enter the harbour. On board are over 1,300 people. More than half are convicts, the rest are soldiers. The people on board are ordered to remain there until dawn. They've travelled for nearly 8 months from England to this unknown land. Around the harbour, the first Australians light fires, and they yell from their canoes for these apparitions to go away.
They thought they was the devil when they landed first. They did not know what to make of them. When they saw them going up the masts, they thought they was possums. Marut, Gamagal people.
At first light, the order is given for the convict men and women to disembark.
And for Aboriginal people, can you imagine? Suddenly there are 11 ships with these strange people wearing clothes, funny hats, they have guns. What are these people up to? Why are they here? How long are they going to stay? Why did they come to my country? Why don't they go somewhere else? Are they spirits? Very strange.
There's this very curious and very touching attempt to come together and to comprehend. So you have these extraordinary scenes within 2 or 3 days of landing of Britishers and Aborigines dancing together.
29th of January, 1788. They pointed with their sticks to the boat landing place and met us in the most cheerful manner. Shouting and dancing, these people mixed with ours, and all hands danced together. William Bradley, First Lieutenant.
And all we've got to go on are the paintings done by a young naval lieutenant called Bradley. And he has these enchanting paintings of redcoats and Aboriginal men indeed dancing together. They're hand in hand. They seem to be dancing. A sort of playground encounter, if you like, when you're trying to check each other out.
Well, we know that the playground encounter idea didn't remain like that. Yeah, it didn't remain like that, and we're going to skip through. We know that there were lots of conflict, and there was massacres, and there was corralling of Aborigines as white settlement expanded. But we're going to have a look at a sequence of events in the 20th century that lead up to where we are now. In the year 1937, a man called William Cooper actually organised a petition from Aboriginal people to King George V. And we have a copy of that petition in the National Archives. You can see it's there on the left. And on the right, I thought it's worth reading some of what's in that petition. Whereas it was not only a moral duty that the original occupants and we, their heirs and successors, should be adequately cared for, your petitioners therefore humbly pray that your Majesty will intervene in our behalf and through the instrument of your Majesty's government in the Commonwealth grant to our people to your Majesty's government in the Commonwealth, grant to our people representation in the federal parliament, either in the person of one of our own blood or by a white man known to have studied our needs and to be in sympathy with our race. So you can see that almost 100 years ago, the idea of Aboriginal people having some representation in the national affairs of the country was raised. Conditions were poor and were unjust for many Aboriginal people around the country. This is just a few examples of actions that were taken. In 1936, Torres Strait Islanders went on strike against poor working conditions. They were asking for the right to be able to spend their own wages as they chose and not have all of their money garnished and just used to pay for things that way. In 1939, over 150 Aboriginal people left the Kumaragunja station to protest management cruelty and exploitation, and they walked 66 kilometres, but they walked across the border into Victoria, which was against the law for Aboriginal people to do at that time. In 1946, 800 Aboriginal pastoral workers from 25 different stations around the Pilbara area all together walked off at the same time, demanding better wages and conditions, and that was a strike that lasted for 3 years. And in 1957, Palm Island workers also went on strike against unfair wages, and the result of that was that the group of men that went on strike were arrested and put in leg irons, and their families were rounded up, and they were all put on a boat and sent across from the island to the mainland into prison, their families as well, which is a pretty shocking kind of response. In 1963, there was another set of petitions, and the Yirrkala bark petitions were sent to the federal parliament, and that's what they looked like. And there is a little video that just gives a brief explanation about them.
That's the voice of Dila Yunupingu reading the petition in Yungu. Dila is the daughter of Mungarawi Yunupingu, a senior Gumatj cultural leader and one of the original signatories of the petition.
If you read the text, it's the most mild, inoffensive set of requests rather than demands. It's really just saying, we've found out that you have stolen our land. This is a précis, of course, probably a rough one. We wanted to point out to you that this land is ours. It's always been ours. It's quite important to us. We wonder if you would mind coming and speaking with us before you progress this any further. And perhaps when you come, you could bring an interpreter so that we can be understood.
And when you say bark petitions, what exactly do you mean?
They were presented on 2 sheets from a stringy bark tree. Each one is marked with written text and then painted with pipe clay, charcoal and ochre.
And so when you think that you will have no writing, that's correct. It's not a text-based society, but it's not a society without massive intellectual and philosophical thought. It has the text, but it's in an oral form. In the initial bark petition, it's in written text for those who are not able to read the designs on the bark. It's in 2 written texts. It's in English first and then translated into Yolngu Matha. But surrounding that other designs that indicate Dua and Irika moieties.
Why are there two pieces of bark?
The Yolngu world is balanced in cosmology between two essences, Irika and Dua. So all people, places, plants, animals, wind directions, cloud, star, constellations, everything is either Irika or Dua, and the same goes for clans and for land. And so when a petition came from the Yolngu, it had to be one from the Irika aspect of life and one from the Dua aspect of life. That's why.
Just a couple of years after that, there was the Freedom Ride, and this is a bit of news footage from the time and some words from Charles Perkins, the Aboriginal leader who organised it.
In 1965, this group of students, known as the Freedom Riders, hit the headlines when they took the struggle from the city to the bush. They bust their way through northwestern New South Wales, breaking down the barriers of prejudice and shattering the blissful ignorance of conservative country towns. When the Freedom Riders forced access to the artesian baths of Moree, racial tensions turned to violence. Overnight, Moree became a focus for the nation's growing guilt about the treatment of blacks in this country.
65 from Walgett after being forced out of Walgett by white people as a result of demonstrations at the RSL club there. And of course, the confrontations at the swimming pool at the time were very dangerous. Police had to form a type of a gauntlet for us to go into the town bars and then come out. We were pelted with eggs and bottles and broken glasses.
The whole Freedom Ride is not so much for the white people, on my mind. My deeper objective was for Aboriginal people to realise, hey, listen, second class is not good enough, you know. You don't have to always be first class, but don't always be second class. And don't cop shit, you know, when you don't have to. And you don't have to live on river banks and in shanty huts and at the end of a road where there's rubbish tip. Live in town. And you don't have to have cop these white men sneaking around pinching Aboriginal women at night, you know. Sitting down the front of picture theatres, not being able to sit in a restaurant, because nobody will allow you as an Aborigine to sit in a restaurant. That's not on. And, you know, and the timing was right. If I didn't do it, somebody else would have done it, and other people have done it in a different way.
Interesting thing to note about the Freedom Ride in 1965 is that one of the United Church ministers who served in the North Belconnen Church at Melba some years ago, Colin Bradford, he was a university student at the time. He was one of the people that was on that Freedom Ride. So that's 1965, and the next year there was the walk off from the Wayfield station, and this is featuring Vincent Lingiari, who later on would become the Aboriginal person that Gough Whitlam picked up sand and let it fall through his hand, saying this land is your land. We've got a short video about Vincent Lingiari.
My name is Vincent Lingiari, came from Taguragu, Waddy Creek Station. Yalang ulung unayana, Waddy Creek ulung, unayani, mulangura, unanyurayani, unayani, Charagabko, Changagani, Kariao, mulangura, Alnyana unamana na Jaragab. That means that I came down here to ask all this Solomon here about the land right. What I got story from my old father or grandpa, that land belonged to me, belonged to Aboriginal men before the horse and the cattle come over on that land, where I'm sitting now. Well, that's what I've been keeping on my mind. Now, I still got it on my mind. That's all the word I can tell you.
And then the next year was the 1967 referendum, and this is a news report about that.
Into account into with more than 90% voting in favour of the changes. The referendum enabled the government to make laws to benefit all Aboriginal people and to take them into account in determining the population of Australia. Western Australia was the least receptive, with just over 80% in favour.
It was 1967 and the nation was in the mood for change. Australians were being asked to vote yes.
The referendum is on Saturday, and it's important that we should have the maximum vote.
It's a matter of democratic right.
Shirley Paisley was a women's rights campaigner in South Australia before taking up the call to push for constitutional change in the 1967 campaign.
Because I think that was the amazing thing for me, just bringing people together.
For Australia's most celebrated referendum, there are still some misconceptions.
It didn't give Aboriginal people citizenship, it didn't give them the vote. In fact, what it did do is change the Australian Constitution, which is the rule book for the nation.
Because Indigenous people already had the right to vote and citizenship, but there were still laws which ignored them. On May 27, more than 90% of Australians voted yes to change the country's birth certificate. The result? Two parts of the Constitution changed. Section 127, which said Aboriginal people shouldn't be counted in population surveys, was removed completely. And the reference to Aboriginal people was removed from Section 51, thus allowing the government to make special laws which benefited Indigenous people.
And that was something that Gough Whitlam took up with gusto in 1972. It's what led to laws around sacred sites, native title and the like. And so that referendum is what has enabled broad and important laws to be made for Aboriginal people nationally.
The 67...
And just to follow on from that important referendum, the Larrakia petition was signed by many people of the Larrakia tribe of Aboriginal people, and in support of them. And that was another land rights claim that was presented to the Parliament. In 1987, there was a Royal Commission into Aboriginal deaths in custody that reported, making many recommendations. The next year, the Barunga Statement was presented to Bob Hawke when he was Prime Minister. He committed to a treaty by 1990, but never took any action on that, and that, of course, didn't come about. In 1990, ATSIC was established. It was later abolished about 15 years later by John Howard's government. In 1992, the Mabo judgment by the High Court recognised native title and set in train the processes for making claims for native title. In 1997, Bringing Them Home, the report of the Human Rights and Equal Opportunity Commission on the Stolen Generation, and it's from that report that we have the annual Sorry Day each year now. And then in 2015, a group of 40 First Nations leaders met with the then Prime Minister Malcolm Turnbull and the then opposition leader Bill Shorten, and to discuss the recommendations of the Referendum Council that had been set up by the government a few years earlier. And they rejected what the Referendum Council was saying and said that any reform must involve substantive changes to the Australian Constitution. And so that brings us to the Uluru Statement, which we've already read earlier, and which does include the specific request for recognition of Aboriginal people in the Constitution and for the establishment of a Makarrata Commission. So, I mean, that's a very brief and selective timeline, particularly focused on the 20th and then the early 21st century. And so we thought that the questions that the Together Yes group is inviting us to think about, are there any dates or events that stand out in what you've heard about there? And what do you think are some of the conclusions that can be drawn, and what kind of bearing might this have on the referendum that we will be having later this year? So your reflections and responses to that material that you've heard in that timeline. That's the next discussion group.
Did you have a good discussion?
Yes.
Any questions out of it? Comments anyone wants to make?
Come and share your question.
I'm sorry. Well, there's a group of us here. I'm not sure if you're
Oh,
aware.
right.
There's a group of 5 of us.
Oh,
So
okay.
that's why we're sort of backwards and forwards. But I had the question that we couldn't really come to an answer to. But in 1967, we weren't aware that the referendum allowed the government to make laws relating to the Aboriginal people. Given that we've now got Aboriginal representatives in Parliament, which is great, and we've got the Uluru Statement, what is the Voice going to achieve that all those things can't? And we talked about, with so many groups of people, Aboriginal people, how are they going to be able to come to an agreement about what particularly they want? And will it just add another layer of complexity to their lives? Will the voices that allowed us to get heard, the voices that are most educated, and the remote communities who at present I don't think are particularly well informed or understand, be able to be represented well?
Truth. That needs a day to answer that.
We were discussing that there's not a lot of detail about being given, and that this is not something that any one of us can address. There's not a lot of detail being given by the government as to how this is all going to play out. And I think that's for quite a number of us here. Our hearts say yes, and our caution says we're not sure.
I think that's why there's such an big undecided group in the polls.
Yes.
That may well be. Did you want to answer any of that, John? Do you want me to have a stab at it?
I mean, part of it is that the Voice, my understanding of the way that the Voice is structured, and that's certainly the way that it's set out in the documentation that has been provided in the Karma report, the report that Tom Karma authored, is that there will be local groups that will be making recommendations to regional groups, and regional groups that will be sending to the national Voice their proposals and recommendations. So it should be a grassroots Aboriginal run enterprise. The reason, so we do have that detail because that's quite a substantive report that was published earlier this year, I think, which indicates that it is going to be structured in that way. And I think
we just ask who wrote that report again?
Tom Karma is the former Social Justice Commissioner.
Yeah.
It's got his name on it, but there's a group of people that were appointed by the government to work to collate that material and to put it out. Yeah. So I think it was published earlier this year. It might have been late last year, but certainly earlier this year.
Yeah. Marcia Langton was involved too.
Sorry?
Marcia
Langton. Yes, that's right. And I think the strength of the Voice will be that it will be a permanent and consolidated entity. It won't be sort of an ad hoc thing, and that it will be providing advice. It won't be telling the government what to do. It will be providing advice and making suggestions and proposals that the government then has to consider and decide how to act upon. In the same way that any industry kind of sends their lobbyists into Parliament House to lobby Parliament to give advice to the government from their point of view.
Yeah,
you'd almost expect that the current Department of Indigenous Affairs would become the bureaucracy for the Voice, because what would be the point of having both of them?
Well, they would presume
bureaucracy for both.
Presume we have to work closely together. Yeah.
And my only concern about going from the remote to the regional to the Voice is all these things generally involve a filtering process, so they'll prioritise. By the time it gets to the voice, you know, some of the things down at the local level are going to get lost, I suspect.
Well, as it is now, I mean, I've been on so many protests in my life, walking across harbour bridges so we don't go to war in Iraq, and stopping the Vietnam War and things like that. And basically, grassroots stuff means nothing to our governments unless it suits them.
Yeah.
Or they really want to be, they really think they're going to be voted out. John Howard did not take a particle of notice of the hundreds of thousands of Australians who marched in some of in that not wanting to go to war with Iraq.
Yeah.
Absolutely took no notice. So I don't think we can sit there and say that our system of government takes notice of our grassroots, and we're not going to vote for the voice because we think it won't take notice of Aboriginal grassroots. And in terms of elected representatives, yes, there is a number of Aboriginal representatives there.
Yes.
The difference is one, they're elected to represent their electorates or to be senators. They're not elected to represent the Aboriginal people. And if you look at the New Zealand Parliament, you'll find that there is enshrined there seats for Maori voices. So that voice is incorporated into the Parliament, and they're part of that, and they represent their people, not their electorate, so, or not, you know, their state in terms of senators. So we can see that, and they're often partisan, they're loyal to their parties. So we have a Green senator saying, I'm going to vote no because it's not a treaty. And we have Liberal people, a Liberal senator or member, I'm not sure which, with Jacinta saying, yeah, I'm going to vote what the Liberal Party says. And then we have the Labor one that's she's working with them to work for a yes vote, saying, well, she's voting obviously with Labor and she's Aboriginal. So you've got these three across the board, and they're representing different groups of people. I don't know there's too many Aboriginal people that particularly like Jacinta Price. They refer to her as a coconut. If you don't know what a coconut is, it's brown on the outside and white in the middle. She's
like
not
like a watermelon.
But isn't that reflective, though, of the variety of opinions and approaches within the Aboriginal community? And would I be right in saying that, in thinking that the Maori people speak one language?
True, I think they do.
They probably do. There's probably
there's a little bit more unity in that. Can I tell you a story I heard in Alice Springs? There were some people came up from down south to talk to the Aboriginal community there about closing the gap, and they had meetings with them and so on and so forth. And at the end of it, after the folk went back down south, the Aboriginal people said, if we close the gap, how are people going to get in and out of Alice Springs? Because they're Alice Springs.
Oh no.
So I guess my concern is that we have all this language and the ideals, but unless we can communicate it or hear the people in the communities hear it and are able to respond to it, how on earth are we going to get some agreement to get the laws made?
I don't think
it's a big question.
I don't think it's as bad as you think. I think the number of Aboriginals who actually agree with Jacinta is almost zero. They're probably all in the Liberal Party. And I'm serious when I say that. The number who agree with Lydia would be considerably larger, but it does not seem to be larger on polls for the number of Aborigines who wish for the referendum to be successful. I mean, with any of those things, it depends on where you are and who is influencing you.
Yeah.
But when people call Jacinta, and Warren Mundine is also a coconut, according to the Aboriginal people, they don't like him at all. And they say he doesn't talk for them.
Yeah.
And where the concentration of Aboriginal populations are, most people do not know where the biggest concentration of Aboriginal people in this country are.
In the cities.
But it's not actually. It's the mid and north coast.
Between Newcastle and Brisbane.
Is that right?
No,
Absolutely, it's right.
but isn't
Yeah.
it?
Right. Okay.
Isn't the
That's
majority though in the
More
major
Aborigines
cities?
there than the Northern Territory.
right. Okay. That's interesting to hear. Yeah, that's
Yeah.
helpful. Yeah.
Yeah. So it's often we have real preconceptions and misconceptions and think we know. I mean, I don't know how many of you have lived with Aboriginals or been among them constantly. John and I have, and that was the Biripi Nation on the mid-north coast. We also interacted with the Worimi, the Gumbaynggirr and the Dunghutti peoples up there, and we learned, it was a very steep learning curve, I can tell you. And that's when they proudly informed us there was more of them than anywhere else in Newcastle and then in the rest of Australia. And they were right when we checked that out. So it's not a good idea to ever presume.
Mm.
I'm not presuming. I'm just asking questions.
Yeah. So that's
Yes.
Yeah. And it is true in remote communities, their thinking's different. It's a much more simple kind of lifestyle and simple kind of way of wondering things about the gap. They've taken that very literally. There are very literal people
Wow.
in
Yes.
the remote communities, especially in the Northern Territory, like those who are Christian, and there is an Aboriginal presbytery in the Northern Synod. Their faith is very simple and quite literal because that's how they are.
Yes. Yeah. Well, there you go. Thank you.
all right. We're going to finish by listening to Jackie Huggins, and then just reflecting briefly on that.
My name's Jackie Huggins, and I am a Bidjara Birigubba Juru woman from Queensland. I was 11 years of age when the 1967 referendum occurred. In the lead up to this, I remember doing fundraising with my mother and other community members. My mother would always say to us, now, when this referendum comes through, we are going to be free people. Free people. And it wasn't until years later that I realised what that actually meant. And I remember the racism that my mother certainly received all her life as a single mother raising 4 children, being denied access to accommodation and being very poor on a war widow's pension. My mother never really considered herself a political person, although she was, but she still said, well, I fought for something I believed in, and that was about to bring justice for our people. I learnt at a very young age that allyship and reconciliation were very important. It was about good people working together to make things better for other people. And certainly that's how I understood it as an 11-year-old that was not even born as a citizen in my own country. This allyship I saw amongst black and white people at that time was really ingrained in me, and I felt it was much easier to speak and to walk with people than fight them. When you know things are unfair, you have to do something about it. The referendum is one way of making all Australians sit up, take note, to be kind and to be empathetic, and to be courageous, to listen, and to know that Aboriginal people have not had a fair deal in this country. We are about to change that. We're about to change the face of this nation. We can get on with life then. We can actually look at the parity of closing the gap, of getting all those horrible statistics reduced, and making better futures, not only for my people, but for the rest of society. To walk in full maturity as a nation, 65,000 years and more old in our country.
Can you tell me how it's going to help with closing the gap?
I think that the theory is, Margot, that if there's an Indigenous group of people who understand better in their cultural context what the problems are, particularly in their communities, and they can advise Parliament specifically on that. That will help address those things that keep that gap there.
Okay, thanks.
That's just a broad-based answer, but yeah. I mean, one of the things, hopefully it might do, part of the problem we have in this country is we have structural racism. And what I mean by that is there's things that are inbuilt into our system that prejudice Black people and favour white people. And often as white people living in a city particularly, you don't notice it. If you live in a country town where there's a lot of Aboriginal people, 12% of the local high school was Indigenous at Wauchope, which is a massive percentage. Right. And an Aboriginal woman said to me, how many black faces do you see in Wauchope when you go about your business? And I thought about that and I thought that was absolutely none, not one. That is structural racism. And locking them up. Aboriginal people get locked times up at the rate 3 times greater than white people for the same offences. So that's structural racism. So hopefully it will address some of those things.
And it's very. I was up in Alice, as I said, about a year ago, and we're in the middle of Alice Springs, just having a walk around, and there was a very drunk Aboriginal woman. And the police were talking to her and picking her up and were quite patronising her. And just across the little walkway, there was a group of whites getting drunk. But no one was going to them and telling them they need to go home, or it is the embedded stuff. And we're in a caravan park where there were guys that were drunk. No one was coming into the caravan park and picking them up and taking them off, whereas this Indigenous woman was being put into the back of the paddy wagon. And there's not equality.
And the history of Alice Springs is such that 4 completely separate nations were herded into a reserve there to get on with one another, and they didn't have quite the same customs, and they didn't speak the same language. And you can look at Alice now and see the result of that.
Yes.
It's nothing good about it.
All right. Just to draw to a close, those of you that got the resources will see that there's a page on further listening and learning. If you want to follow up, they give a whole lot of different resources, books, TV, programs, podcasts, songs, etc. That you are able to, it tells you how to access them and where you can listen to them or watch them or buy them. That's an additional resource that's provided. We thought we are meeting again in 2 weeks' time. And session 2 at this same time will be called Enshrining a Voice, and the material for that looks more specifically at some of the questions that we were teasing around towards the end there about the voice and how it would work and what it would mean. So that's in 2 weeks' time.
On the 7th, isn't it?
Yes, that's right. If you were interested, we making the offer. There's this little half-hour movie called Barbecue Area, which was made some years ago. We can't actually do a session this time next Thursday evening, but with the Thursday morning group, we're going to watch that at 10 o'clock using the same link. It's just a half-hour video. We thought we would watch that and then reflect on it together. So you're welcome to join us for the Thursday morning next week if you wanted to be part of that. And then we'll be back in 2 weeks' time for session 2, Enshrining a Voice.